The first thing you noticed when you came to Verenka in January was not the smoke. Smoke in the coal valleys of central Pennsylvania was a commonplace. It rose from chimneys and from the tailings piles on the ridgelines and from the flue stacks of the processing facility on the east edge of town. Smoke was what Verenka smelled like. It was what the men who worked the mines smelled like when they came home in the evenings. The mineral, deep earth scent that no amount of soap ever completely removed from the creases of their hands. The first thing you noticed was the warmth. Not warmth in the air, but warmth in the ground. If you walked across the cemetery at the edge of Prospect Street on a cold January morning, you could feel it through the soles of your boots. A gentle, persistent heat that had no business being there, radiating up from the frozen earth as if something beneath the graveyard was still alive. In certain spots along the lower end of Haber Street, the snow melted as fast as it fell, leaving odd patches of bare brown grass in the middle of the white blanketed yards, like bald spots on a winter scalp. Children stopped remarking on it. Adults had stopped remarking on it years before. It had been there long enough that it had become, simply, what the ground was like in Verenka. Elena Vasko noticed everything. She was 63 years old and had lived in Verenka since the age of 6, arriving with her parents from western Ukraine in 1931, the year the Consolidated Anthracite Company was still hiring immigrants and willing to advance train fare from New York to men with strong backs and no English. She had grown up speaking Ukrainian at home and English in the street. She had married a man named Frank Vasko, who had worked the Meridian shaft for 22 years until his lungs retired him a decade before his body did. She had buried Frank in the cemetery at the end of Prospect Street in 1974, in a patch of ground that was, even then, noticeably warmer than the earth around it. By 1979, Elena knew several things about the warmth in the ground beneath Verenka that the state agencies and the borough council and the representatives from the coal company did not seem officially to know. She knew that the warmth was spreading. She knew this because she had been walking the same streets for 5 decades, and the patches of snow-free ground were larger now and more numerous than they had been 10 years ago. She knew that in the basement of her house on Haber Street, the smell collected in corners, the mineral sulfurous smell of coal combustion on certain mornings when the wind was still and the air pressure sat low over the valley. She knew that her neighbor, a retired miner named Bogdan Rybak, had nailed a note to the door of the borough hall the previous spring that read, in his careful, deliberate hand, "The ground under my kitchen is 104 degrees. Someone should know this." Whether anyone official did know, and what knowing had prompted them to do, was the question Elena had been trying to answer for the better part of 4 years. The town of Verenka had been incorporated in 1871, 5 years after the war, when the valley was mapped and platted by a surveyor named Augustine Collard, who had the task of imposing a grid on ground that had been mined in a haphazard fashion since the 1830s. The grid he imposed was tidy on paper. The ground beneath it was anything but. 4 decades of small-scale extraction had left behind a labyrinthine network of tunnels and shafts and abandoned chambers, some partially flooded, some sealed with nothing more than rotted timber and a fill of coal dust and clay, some connected to newer workings in ways that no single engineer had ever mapped comprehensively. The major coal company, Consolidated Anthracite, arrived in the valley in 1869 and bought out the smaller operators one by one. They brought with them the industrial discipline and the capital equipment that transformed extraction from a cottage industry into a systematic enterprise. They also inherited all the confusion and incompleteness of what had come before. Their own engineers produced maps of the underground, but those maps were drawn from survey data that was incomplete at best and strategically vague at worst, covering the company's own workings in detail and leaving large areas of the old small-scale tunneling designated simply as unmapped legacy works, a phrase that covered a multitude of engineering sins. The miners who actually worked those tunnels knew them differently. They knew them the way you know your own house in the dark, by feel, by instinct, by the accumulated bodily memory of thousands of passages through the same spaces. They knew which corridors connected to which. They knew where the ceilings were low and where the floor dipped and where the air went stale in wet weather. They knew which of the sealed passages were genuinely sealed and which were sealed only with the optimism of a company that preferred not to spend money on permanent solutions. Elena Vasko, Elena's father-in-law, who had come to Verenka from the same region of Ukraine as Elena's parents, had worked the Meridian shaft from 1921 until a roof fall put him on the surface for good in 1938. He kept a small notebook in the breast pocket of his work jacket, adding to it in the evenings, in Ukrainian, in a cramped and careful hand. The notebook passed to Frank when Dmytro died in 1961, and Frank passed it to Elena when he died. And Elena had read it so many times by 1979 that she had it nearly memorized. In an entry from the summer of 1934, Dmytro had written, "The old number 6 corridor that we were told is sealed. I can feel air moving through the wall across from the 3rd support timber. Not much air, but moving. Whatever is on the other side of that wall, the company says, is not there. But air does not move through walls for nothing. The company says is not there, but air does not move through walls for nothing." Elena thought about that entry often in the years after the warmth in the ground began to concern her. She thought about it the way you think about something that makes a pattern with other things you know. Air moving through a wall where no passage was supposed to be. A corridor that did not appear on the official survey. An underground architecture that nobody had ever fully mapped. She thought about those things, and she thought about the municipal dump at the edge of the cemetery, the old strip mine pit where the borough had been burning its refuse every summer, and she thought about the spring of 1968 when the burning had stopped being ordinary. The year the burning didn't stop. The dump at Verenka had been burning every summer for as long as anyone could clearly remember. The borough council would authorize the fire department to conduct a controlled burn of accumulated refuse in the pit mine on the north edge of the cemetery property. The fire would be set, the garbage would burn down, the fire would be extinguished. It was a simple, unremarkable piece of municipal housekeeping. The kind of thing that got 3 lines in the meeting minutes and was forgotten by the following week. On the 3rd of June, 1968, the fire department set the annual burn. The following day, a Friday, a crew member noticed that one corner of the pit was still smoldering. He applied water. Saturday morning, the smoldering had spread rather than contracted. More water was applied. Monday, it was worse. The fire chief, a man named Leonard Polakowski, who had been doing this job for 11 years and had conducted perhaps 20 seasonal burns without significant incident, called the state office in Harrisburg on the Tuesday. He described what he was observing. The state dispatched an inspector the following week. The inspector's name was George Sefton. He was 31 years old, had a degree in geological engineering from Penn State, and had been working for the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries for 3 years. He arrived in Verenka on a Wednesday morning in mid-June, walked the perimeter of the dump site with Polakowski, took temperature readings at several points along the pit wall, and wrote his report that evening in his motel room in the neighboring town of Dunor. The report was 4 pages long. Its central finding was that the fire had penetrated a seam, a shallow, unmapped seam running along the eastern wall of the old pit, and had begun moving through the underlying coal. The report recommended immediate intervention, specifically the excavation of the affected area and the removal of all burning material before the fire could establish itself in the seam system. The cost estimate Sefton included in his report was $210,000. He marked the report urgent in the upper right corner of the cover page. The report arrived in Harrisburg on June 20, 1968. It was logged and assigned a case number. It was reviewed by Sefton's supervisor, a division chief named Malcolm Pryor, who initialed it and sent it upward through the department hierarchy. It reached the desk of the Deputy Secretary for Mine Safety on July 8th, which was 18 days after it arrived and 22 days after the fire had found the seam. The Deputy Secretary's name was Arthur Hollis. He was 54 years old. Before joining the department 12 years earlier, he had worked as a regulatory affairs consultant for a company called Eastern Mineral Holdings, which was a subsidiary of the same conglomerate that had held mineral rights to the coal seams beneath Verenka since 1869. He had left that position when the then governor of Pennsylvania had appointed him to the department, a move that was reported in a single paragraph in a trade publication and noted by no one else. Arthur Hollis read George Sefton's report. He made 2 phone calls on the day he received it. The records of those calls do not appear in any department archive. On July 12th, 4 days after receiving the report, he wrote a memo directing that Sefton's findings be formally referred to a newly constituted interagency working group that would develop a coordinated response strategy. The working group held its first meeting on August 29, 1968. By that date, the fire had been burning underground for 87 days. Elena Vasko did not know any of this in the summer of 1968. What she knew was what her neighbors knew: that the dump was still smoking, that the fire department had been out to the pits several times without apparent success, and that the borough council, at its July meeting, had issued a statement saying the situation was under review and that the state was involved and that residents should not be alarmed. Her friend and neighbor, Helena Morose, whose husband Stepan had worked the Meridian shaft alongside Frank Vasko for 15 years, stopped by Elena's kitchen on a Tuesday evening in late July with a piece of information that had come to her through a chain of people she declined to specify precisely. "My husband's cousin works in the county assessor's office," Helena said, accepting a cup of tea and sitting down at the kitchen table with the particular settling-in gesture of someone who has something important to communicate. "He says they've been getting calls from Consolidated, quietly, asking about property values, about the assessed worth of the houses in the lower borough." Elena set down her own cup. What kind of question is that for a coal company to be asking? That's what the cousin thought. He says it was described as routine market research, but he's been in the assessor's office for 8 years, and nobody from a coal company has ever called him asking about residential property values before. They sat with that for a moment. Through the window, the evening was quiet. Down the hill, the cemetery was visible in the fading light, its granite markers gray and still. If you walked to the cemetery at that hour and pressed your palm to the earth between certain graves, you would feel the warmth rising through the soil. Not alarming, not dramatic, just there. A persistent, patient warmth that had no ordinary explanation. "They know something," Elena said. "Yes," Helena said. "I think they know something." The excavation contractor was a company based in Allentown that had experience with mine reclamation work and had submitted the second lowest bid for the contract. The lowest bidder had been rejected for reasons the contract file does not specify. Their work was constrained by 2 conditions included in the state's contract specifications. First, that all excavation be limited to the area already identified in the working group's report without exploratory digging beyond those boundaries. Second, that work be conducted only during standard weekday business hours. The Allentown contractor's project foreman, a man named Robert Kessler who had 20 years of mine reclamation experience, wrote an internal memorandum to his company's management in September of 1969, noting that the constraints imposed by the contract specifications made it impossible to work at a pace that could outrun the fire's movement. The fire, he observed, did not respect standard business hours. It spread on evenings and weekends at the same rate it spread on Tuesday afternoons. The excavation perimeter was being set before the exploratory work necessary to establish where the actual fire edge was located, which meant they were digging in the wrong place relative to where the fire currently was. Kessler sent a copy of this memorandum to the state's project manager. He received an acknowledgement. The contract conditions were not modified. The excavation project ran through November 1969. The contractor declared it complete. The state issued a press release stating that suppression efforts had been successful and the situation was under control. A small item ran in the county newspaper. No reporter visited Verenka to check whether the ground was still warm. It was. It was warmer, in fact, than it had been before the excavation, because the digging had opened channels through which oxygen could reach the burning seam at greater depth. Internal Memorandum. Department of Mines and Mineral Industries, December 4, 1969. Verenka Borough Mine Fire, Post-Suppression Assessment. Inspector Sefton conducted follow-up site visit on November 28, 1969. Subsurface temperature readings at 12 monitoring points show continued combustion activity in all sectors. Fire perimeter appears to have advanced approximately 200 feet southeast of the original dump site during the period of the suppression operation. It is the inspector's assessment that the suppression effort, while conducted in good faith and in accordance with contract specifications, has not succeeded in extinguishing the underground fire. Continued monitoring is recommended. Note: Inspector Sefton requests guidance on whether this assessment should be included in the Public Project Completion Report, awaiting direction from Division Chief. No response notation in file. George Sefton's post-suppression assessment was not included in the Public Completion Report. It remained in his personal case file, which was transferred to the Division Archive when Sefton resigned from the department in 1971 to take a position with a private engineering firm in Bethlehem. In the archive, it was filed under a case number that had been superseded by a new administrative numbering system introduced in 1970, which meant that without knowing its original case number, you could not readily find it. Sefton left the department without making further formal complaint about the handling of the Verenka case. He was 34 years old with a young family and a mortgage on a house in Camp Hill. He knew what he had seen, and he had put what he had seen in writing, and nothing had come of it. This was, he had concluded, one of those situations where a man had to decide whether the right thing to do was to keep fighting a battle he could not win inside a system that did not want to fight it, or to take himself out of that system and build a life for his family outside of it. He chose the life. He was not a bad man. He was a man who understood his limitations and the limitations of the institution he had served, and who had decided that he could not single-handedly overcome either. This is one of the ways that catastrophes sustain themselves, not through the decisions of villains, but through the accumulated reasonable-sounding choices of ordinary men who understood what was happening and did the small calculation of self-preservation and came down on the side of self-preservation and went home to their families and tried not to think about it. Living above it. By 1974, when Frank Vasko died of emphysema, complicated by the kind of lung degradation that 22 years of mine work produced in a man's body, the fire had been burning for 6 years. It had spread to the point where the warmth in the ground was perceptible across roughly a third of Verenka's residential area, the lower third, where the streets ran close to the old seam network, where the houses were oldest and where most of the Ukrainian and Slovak families who had come to the valley in the 1920s and 30s had settled. The upper borough, where the professionals and the mine managers had always lived, where the houses sat on a different geological formation, was not affected. This division, the lower borough burning, the upper borough untouched, would later seem, to some people who thought carefully about it, like a detail worth noting. Life in the lower borough during the middle years of the fire's spread had a quality that is difficult to describe from the outside because it was so thoroughly mundane. People went to work. The school opened every morning and closed every afternoon. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church on Slavic Street held its liturgies and its suppers and its Easter celebrations. The bar on the corner of Haber and Main served its regulars from 4 in the afternoon until 11 at night, 6 days a week. Women visited each other's kitchens in the mornings. Men played cards at the Polish club on Friday evenings. Children walked to school through streets where the cracks in the pavement let up thin wisps of vapor in cold weather, and those children did not think of those wisps as alarming because they had been there as long as those children could remember. The accommodation of the extraordinary within the framework of the ordinary is not a pathology. It is how human communities survive conditions that would, if fully confronted all at once, be paralyzing. The people of Verenka's lower borough were not in denial. They talked about the fire constantly, at the bar, in the kitchens, at the borough council meetings that had become, in those years, a monthly ritual of contained frustration. They knew it was there. They knew it was spreading. They knew the state had made an attempt to put it out that had not worked and had told them it had worked anyway, which was perhaps the detail that most clearly defined the particular quality of their situation. What they could not do, and this is the thing that distinguished their situation from a simple case of a community in the grip of a manageable crisis, was act on their knowledge in any way that produced a result. They could write letters, and they did. They could attend meetings, and they did. They could contact representatives, and they did. And the representatives would contact the agencies, and the agencies would issue statements noting that the situation was being monitored and that appropriate steps were being taken, and the ground continued to warm. Elena Vasko's campaign to understand what was happening beneath her town began in earnest the winter after Frank died. Grief, she found, clarified things. You had less patience for pretense when you were living in its aftermath. You were less willing to accept the bureaucratic language of careful non-commitment as if it were a form of communication rather than a form of evasion. She began by making a list. In the back of a composition notebook she had bought at the drugstore on Main Street, she cataloged everything she knew or could learn about the fire's history. Dates, names, events, the statements that had been made publicly, and the evidence that contradicted them. She was systematic about it in the way that a woman who had raised 4 children and managed the finances of a household on a miner's wage for 20 years was systematic about things. She did not have legal training or engineering expertise or access to the filing cabinets in Harrisburg. What she had was time, attention, and the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had been watching and listening to things closely for a long time. Her neighbor, Bogdan Rybak, contributed to the notebook. He had a miner's practical understanding of underground geology, and he could explain things to Elena in language that translated between the technical and the plainly human in a way that she found more useful than any state document. He told her about seam connectivity, the way anthracite deposits were not isolated pockets, but networked systems running through the hillsides in veins that connected to other veins through the labyrinthine passages of old workings. He drew her a rough map one evening at her kitchen table, a hand-drawn approximation of what he understood about the underground beneath Verenka's lower borough, based on the knowledge accumulated across 3 generations of his family who had worked those shafts. "The company always knew," he said, not bitterly, just as a statement of fact. "You cannot mine coal for 100 years without knowing the shape of what you are mining. What they knew and what they put on the official maps were 2 different things. The official maps showed what was convenient to show." "And the dump?" Elena said. Bogdan ran his finger along the map to the north edge of the cemetery. "Right here is where the old pit mine from the 1930s sits, and right here," he traced a line southeast, "is how the old workings run from that pit down under Haber Street and further." He looked at her. "Anyone who knew the underground the way the company knew it would have known that burning in that pit was a risk." This was the thing Elena had been circling for years without being able to name it precisely. Not that the fire had started. Accidents happened, garbage burns went wrong, coal seams caught. But that someone, somewhere, had the information that would have prevented the burning from happening at that location, or had known immediately when the fire began to spread what it would take to stop it, and had not acted on that knowledge in time. "Or chose not to," she said. Bogdan looked at her. He was 71 years old and had spent his working life in an industry that had never considered his well-being a significant operational priority. He had a particular quality of non-surprise, that quality that long experience of institutional indifference confers on a person who has paid close attention. "That too," he said. The boy on Haber Street. The event that changed everything for Verenka happened on a Saturday morning in March of 1977, on a cold, clear day when the sky above the valley was a hard, brilliant blue, and the remaining snow on the north-facing slopes had the particular crystalline brightness of late winter snow on the verge of melting. A boy named Mykola Horan, 12 years old, the son of a man who worked the last operational mine in the valley and the grandson of a man who had come from the same part of western Ukraine as Elena Vasko's parents, was playing in the side yard of his family's house at the corner of Haber Street and Birch Alley. The yard was familiar territory. He had played in it his whole life. He knew every inch of it the way a 12-year-old boy knows the territory of his own freedom, intimately, without thinking about it, the way you know the feel of your own clothes. He had noticed, vaguely, over the past few winters, that there was a patch near the back fence where the snow melted faster than elsewhere, and where in summer the grass grew in a pale, struggling way that was different from the grass in the rest of the yard. He had registered this the way children register background anomalies, as part of the furniture of his world, unremarkable, not worth investigating. When the ground gave way beneath him, it gave way without any warning whatsoever. One moment the earth was solid under his boots, the next it was not. The surface layer of soil, desiccated and undermined by years of heat and rising gases from the fire below, simply gave way under his weight, the way a thin crust of ice gives way over a deep puddle. The hole that opened was roughly 4 feet across. It deepened quickly. From below, a wave of heat and the mineral smell of deep combustion rose past him, the smell of something very old burning very far down. Mykola's hands found the edge. His fingers dug into the crumbling soil. The edge crumbled further. He was 12 years old and strong for his age, a miner's grandson, built for endurance, and he held. His older sister, Oksana, 14, was at the back door of the house when it happened. She ran. She reached the edge of the hole and grabbed his wrist and pulled and screamed for her parents and pulled. The hole continued to crumble outward. Mykola's other hand found a root from the fence post. He held the root. Oksana held his wrist. Their father was there in 30 seconds, alerted by Oksana's scream, and he pulled them both back from the edge of a hole that was by then 6 feet across, and, as the borough fire chief would later estimate, based on the time it took a stone to hit the bottom, somewhere between 60 and 120 feet deep. From below, the warmth rose like breathing. The photographs that ran in the Philadelphia newspapers 2 days later showed the hole fenced off with orange construction tape, a team of state inspectors in hard hats standing at its perimeter, and, in the background, barely visible, Elena Vasko in her good coat, standing on the sidewalk in front of the Horan house with a composition notebook open in her hands. She had kept that notebook for 3 years. In it were the dates and contents of 7 letters she had written to the Department of Environmental Resources and the form responses she had received. There were the notes from Bogdan Rybak's kitchen table explanation of seam connectivity and the hand-drawn map he had made. There were the names of 5 Verenka residents who had submitted written complaints to state agencies about carbon monoxide levels in their homes, and the dates of those submissions, and the dates of the acknowledgement letters they had received. There was a section at the back where Elena had catalogued, month by month, the expansion of the warm patches in the ground across the lower borough, not with instruments, but with the careful observational record of a woman who had been paying attention. What she had not known, until a journalist from the Philadelphia Inquirer who was standing next to her on that sidewalk told her, was that the state was in possession of a geological assessment commissioned 6 years before the fire started in 1962 by Eastern Mineral Holdings that had identified the old pit mine at the north edge of the cemetery as a specific risk for fire transmission to the underlying seam network. The assessment had been filed with the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries in early 1963. It had never been shared with the Borough Council. It had never been referenced in any public communication about the fire. It had been found, the journalist told her, by a graduate student in the state archives who had been researching something else entirely. Elena stood on the sidewalk in front of the Horan house and looked at the fenced-off hole in the yard where Mykola had nearly disappeared and held her notebook against her chest for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "How long have they had it?" "Since 1963, the journalist said, and they said nothing. The document exists. Whether anyone made a decision about it, that's harder to establish. Someone decided not to act on it, Elena said. Deciding not to act is still deciding. The calculus of acceptable loss. The legislative hearing convened in Harrisburg in October of 1977, 7 months after the sinkhole on Haber Street had produced a set of photographs that were, in the words of the committee chair, impossible to look away from. Elena Vasko testified on the third day. She came with her composition notebook and with a collection of correspondence. Every letter she had sent and every form response she had received over 3 years of trying to communicate that something was wrong beneath her town. She spread the papers on the table. There were 37 pieces of correspondence. She arranged them in chronological order, the letters she had written on the left and the state responses on the right, so that the table held a visual record of the conversation she had been trying to have, or rather that she had been trying to have, while the state had substituted acknowledgement for engagement and monitoring for action. She testified for 45 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She had prepared what she wanted to say, and she said it in the order she had prepared it, pausing occasionally to find the relevant document in her arrangement on the table and read a specific date or a specific sentence from a letter. At the end of her testimony, the committee chair asked her what she thought should happen. 3 things, Elena said. The residents of the lower borough should be relocated at full and fair compensation to housing of equivalent quality. The underground fire should receive whatever resources are necessary to contain it, even if containment is no longer possible and the only realistic goal is preventing further spread. And there should be a full public accounting of what was known and when and by whom about the risk of fire transmission at that dump site and why that information was never communicated to the Borough Council or to the people of Verenka. The committee chair nodded. He was a careful man who had learned to nod in a way that communicated attentiveness without commitment. "And if the third thing doesn't happen," Elena said, "if there is no accounting, then we know that the people of Verenka were, in someone's calculation, an acceptable loss, and whoever made that calculation should have to say so in public with their name attached." Nobody ever said so in public with their name attached. What remains? The town of Verenka was not demolished all at once. It was dismantled over a period of years in the way that things dismantled by bureaucratic process always are, unevenly, incompletely, with long pauses between phases during which the remaining structures stood in various states of abandonment, their windows boarded, their yards reverting to the vegetation that moved into abandoned human spaces with a speed that always surprised people who hadn't watched it happen before. By 1990, the lower borough was gone in the physical sense. The houses cleared, the streets left in place but increasingly cracked, the sidewalk curbing swallowed by grass and the advancing edges of forest. The upper borough retained a few dozen occupied houses, occupied by people who lived there because the fire had not reached the geological formation beneath them, or by people who had simply decided, for reasons of their own, that they were not leaving regardless of what the state said or did not say about the fire's current location. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church on Slavic Street held its last regular service in October of 1989. The final liturgy was conducted by a priest who had been born in the town and was the third generation of his family to attend that church. After the service, a small group of the remaining and returned congregation stood in the churchyard for an hour, talking in a mixture of Ukrainian and English in the way that people of that generation did before dispersing to their respective cars. The church was demolished in 1991. The cemetery, being a cemetery, was left. The graves remained. The groundskeeping, which had once been maintained by the congregation, was taken over sporadically by former residents who returned for the purpose and left to its own devices in between. The headstones remained, and the grass grew around them, and in winter the snow melted unevenly in the areas where the ground beneath was warmest, leaving the grave markers standing in patches of green and brown in the middle of white fields. Frank Vasko's grave was among them. In winter, the snow around his headstone never fully settled. The warmth rising from below kept the earth just above freezing, even on the coldest January nights. It was, in its way, a strange and involuntary immortality, the fire that had taken his town keeping the earth above his grave perpetually close to living temperature. Elena would have found this either deeply comforting or deeply terrible, perhaps both simultaneously, which was the emotional register that Verenka tended to produce in the people who had loved it. In 1993, a researcher named Patricia Malone, completing a doctoral dissertation on post-industrial community dissolution at Bucknell University, drove to Verenka on a Tuesday in November to walk the streets of the lower borough and take photographs for her work. She had been studying Verenka's history for 2 years and had read everything publicly available about the fire, the failed suppression attempts, the legislative hearings, the relocation process. She had expected, she wrote later in the acknowledgement section of her published dissertation, to find something that felt like a ruin, dramatic, legible as catastrophe, the landscape equivalent of a wound. What she found instead was something much stranger, and in its strangeness, much more disturbing. The streets were intact. The curbs were there, cracked but present. The sidewalks were broken in places by tree roots and subsidence, but they ran the full length of the blocks where houses had once stood. Vacant lots where houses had been cleared showed the faint outlines of their foundations beneath the grass, rectangles of slightly different vegetation marking where walls had stood and basements had opened. It looked, she wrote, not like a place that had been destroyed, but like a place from which the human element had been carefully removed, leaving the infrastructure of community behind. The streets without houses, the sidewalks without walkers, the curbs lining roads that nobody drove anymore, leading to intersections where nobody needed to slow down. She stood at the corner of Haber Street and Birch Alley, she had the address from her research, and looked at the vacant lot where the Horan house had stood. The lot was overgrown. The fence that Mikola's father had built along the property line was mostly gone, a few fence posts remaining in the ground. Near the back of the lot, in the area where the sinkhole had opened 16 years earlier, the ground was visibly different. A slight depression, not dramatic, not alarming, just a gentle concavity in the earth's surface, suggesting that something below had settled. She pressed her hand to the ground there. Even in November, even with the air temperature in the low 40s, the earth was warm. Not alarmingly warm, warm the way a body is warm, warm the way something alive is warm. She stayed there for a long time with her hand on the ground, feeling the heat come up through the soil from whatever was burning 100 feet below. The streets without houses, the sidewalks without walkers, the curbs lining roads that nobody drove anymore, leading to intersections where nobody needed to slow down. The document that changed the understanding of what had happened in Verenka was found in 2001, 33 years after the fire began its underground movement through the seam network by a man named Daniel Furco, who was not looking for it. Furco was a paralegal working for an environmental law firm in Scranton that had recently taken on a case involving a different mine fire in a different part of the Pennsylvania coal region. His work required him to spend several days in the state archives in Harrisburg, pulling files on the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries' historical response to underground combustion events. He was working through a collection of filing cabinets that had been transferred from a regional office that was closed in 1985 as part of a departmental reorganization and whose contents had been boxed and archived without comprehensive cataloging. The folder was misfiled under a subject heading for Luzerne County rather than Columbia County. It was in the third drawer of the fifth cabinet, between a routine mine inspection report from 1967 and a contractor invoice from 1971. It was a thin folder, 7 pages, slightly yellowed at the edges, the staple in the upper corner beginning to rust. The top page was a routing memo dated March 14, 1963. It noted that the attached report, a geological assessment prepared by an engineering firm working for Eastern Mineral Holdings, had been received by the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries on the above date and was being forwarded to the relevant division for review. The assessment itself was 5 pages. It described the geological structure of the seam system beneath Verenka Borough and the northern section of Columbia County with a thoroughness that made clear that Eastern Mineral Holdings had invested significant resources in understanding the underground formation they held rights to. One section, 3 paragraphs long, addressed the old strip mine pit at the northern edge of the cemetery property. The language was technical and hedged, the language of engineers who understood they were producing a document that might someday matter in ways they couldn't fully predict. But the substance was unambiguous. Geological Assessment, Eastern Mineral Holdings, February 1963. The pit excavation at Cemetery Road presents specific risk conditions that warrant attention. The pit's eastern and southeastern walls adjoin and, in several locations, penetrate to legacy workings from the pre-1900 extraction period. These workings are incompletely mapped but are understood based on cross-referencing of available survey data and miner testimony to connect to the primary seam system at depths between 40 and 90 feet. Any combustion event occurring within the pit, including controlled burning operations of the type currently conducted for municipal waste disposal purposes, should be considered at elevated risk for fire transmission to the connected seam network. It is recommended that municipal authorities be advised of this risk condition prior to any future burning operations at this site, and that such burning be conducted under qualified supervision with fire suppression equipment immediately available. This assessment was prepared for internal planning purposes and submitted to the State Department in fulfillment of regulatory disclosure requirements. The routing memo at the front of the folder bore 3 initials in the corner where a reviewer's notation would have been entered. The initials were AH. They were the initials of Arthur Hollis, who had been Deputy Secretary for Mine Safety from 1957 to 1969, who had previously worked as a regulatory affairs consultant for Eastern Mineral Holdings, and who had been the official most immediately positioned to act on the assessment's recommendation that municipal authorities be advised of the risk. Municipal authorities had not been advised. The Borough Council had not been advised. The fire had been set 5 years after the document was received. The document had sat in a cabinet in a regional office for 38 years and then in an archive for 16 more, until Daniel Furco, who was looking for something else entirely, found it in a drawer beneath a misfiled subject heading and held it in his hands and understood what he was looking at. Furco contacted his supervising attorney, who contacted an attorney who had done work on Verenka-related cases in the early 1980s, who contacted Patricia Malone, whose dissertation on Verenka's dissolution was by then a published book with a modest but serious academic readership. Malone contacted the journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer who had covered the sinkhole story in 1977 and the legislative hearings and the relocation. The journalist was 63 years old and had been retired for 2 years and was writing a memoir of her 30 years in newspapers. She unretired herself for this story. It ran on the front page of the Sunday Inquirer in April of 2002 under the headline, "The Document Harrisburg Didn't Act On." A coal company warned of Verenka fire risk in 1963. Nobody told the town. Arthur Hollis had died in 1991. Eastern Mineral Holdings had been absorbed into a larger energy company in 1976, which had itself been absorbed into a still larger conglomerate in 1989. That conglomerate's communications office issued a statement saying that it had no comment on historical documents predating its existence and that it could not speak to the actions of entities that no longer existed in their original corporate form. The state government issued a statement expressing regret for the documented failures of the response to the Verenka mine fire and noting that the relevant officials from the period in question were deceased and that current departmental protocols had been substantially revised to prevent similar coordination failures. No investigation was opened. No legislative hearing was held. No formal finding was issued about the nature of the decision, if it was a decision, that had resulted in the 1963 assessment being received and filed without the recommended communication to borough authorities. The article ran. It was cited in Patricia Malone's revised edition of her book, published in 2004. It was referenced in 2 subsequent academic papers on regulatory capture in the Pennsylvania coal industry. It was not followed up. The fire continued to burn. No investigation was opened. No legislative hearing was held. No formal finding was issued about the nature of the decision, if it was a decision, that had resulted in the 1963 assessment being received and filed without the recommended communication to borough authorities. The article ran. It was cited in Patricia Malone's revised edition of her book, published in 2004. It was referenced in 2 subsequent academic papers on regulatory capture in the Pennsylvania coal industry. It was not followed up. The fire continued to burn. They were also read once by Mykola Horan, who was 40 years old when he drove to Bloomsburg on a Saturday in May and sat in the reading room of the university library and requested the 3 notebooks and read them from beginning to end. He was a civil engineer by that point, working for a firm in Allentown that did environmental remediation consulting. He had spent his professional career working on contaminated site assessment and remediation, a choice, he had always understood, that was not unconnected to the morning in March of 1977 when the ground of his grandmother's yard had opened beneath him. He read Elena's notebooks without taking notes, which was unusual for him. He simply read. The careful dates, the names of the officials she had contacted and the dates of their responses, the documentation of the warming ground, the record of what she had been told and what she had observed with her own eyes. When he was done, he sat in the reading room for a while with the notebooks closed on the table in front of him. Then he got in his car and drove south, through the valley where the Pennsylvania Dutch gave way to the Appalachian ridges, and he drove to what was left of Verenka and walked the streets of the lower borough in the late afternoon light. The lower borough in 2005 was 37 years into its slow reclamation by the natural world. The street grid was still visible. You could follow the old lines of Haber Street and Birch Alley and Prospect Street by the curbing that remained and by the different texture of the vegetation where pavement had once been laid. The old foundation outlines were more distinct in some places, less in others, depending on how the demolition crews had done their work and how vigorously the vegetation had moved in. The cemetery was the most intact thing in the lower borough. Cemeteries always are. The headstones stood in rows in the late afternoon light, the grass around them green and uneven, the paths between the rows grass-covered but still discernible. The groundskeeping had been intermittent over the years, and the edges were shaggy, but the general order of the place was maintained by the simple solidity of the markers, which required no maintenance to remain standing. Mikola walked to Frank Vasko's grave. He had met Elena Vasko several times as a child. She was his mother's friend, part of the texture of the lower borough community he had grown up in and then been removed from. He stood at the grave for a moment, and then, as Patricia Malone had done 12 years before, and as Elena herself had done the morning she left, he pressed his hand to the earth. The warmth came up through the soil with the same patient, steady quality it had always had. It was not alarming, it was not dramatic, it was simply there. The signature of a fire burning in the dark 100 feet below, a fire that had been burning for 37 years and would burn for 100 more, consuming the coal in its slow, systematic way, indifferent to everything that had happened on the surface above it. He thought about the morning the ground gave way. He thought about his cousin's hand on his wrist. He thought about the notebooks in the archive in Bloomsburg and about the woman who had kept them, and about the letters she had written and the form responses she had received, and about the document in the filing cabinet that had told someone in 1963 exactly what the risk was and what should be done about it. He thought about the word decision, about the fact that choosing not to act is itself a choice, about the difference between incompetence and indifference and deliberateness, and about how, from the perspective of the people who live above the thing that burns, the difference between those three things is academic. The fire burns the same way, regardless of the name you give to the choice that allowed it to start. The question nobody answers. There is a question that attaches itself to every account of what happened in Verenka, the way a smell attaches itself to certain kinds of fabric and cannot be fully washed out. It is not a complicated question. It does not require specialist knowledge to formulate or to understand, but it has never received a satisfactory answer, despite the legislative hearings and the newspaper investigations and the academic studies and the oral history projects that have tried, over the decades, to reckon with what the fire in Verenka's lower borough actually was. The question is this: who knew, and when, and what did knowing obligate them to do? The partial answers are available in the historical record. Eastern Mineral Holdings knew by February of 1963 that burning at the cemetery pit posed a specific risk of fire transmission to the seam network. Their engineering assessment said so in clear, if carefully hedged, technical language. Arthur Hollis received that assessment in March of 1963, routed it for review, and initialed the routing memo. Whether he read it carefully, whether he understood its implications, whether he made any decision about how to act on its recommendation, these things are not documented. The phone calls he made on the day he received it are not in any record. What is in the record is the absence of any communication to the Verenka Borough Council about the risk identified in the assessment. That communication, if it had been made, might have prevented the 1968 burning. It might have led the council to choose a different site or to conduct the burn under the supervised conditions the assessment recommended. It might have changed everything. It was not made. The coal seams beneath Verenka, according to the engineers who have modeled the fire's progression, still contain enough unburned coal to sustain combustion for another century and a half. The fire will outlast everyone who remembers the town. It will outlast the headstones in the cemetery, which will eventually crack and fall in the slowly subsiding earth. It will outlast the curbing on Haber Street and the foundation outlines in the overgrown lots and the fence posts from the Horan family's side yard. It will be burning in its patient geological way long after the last human memory of Verenka has passed out of existence. Elena Vasko's 3 composition notebooks are still in the Bloomsburg University archive. They are in good condition, being acid-free paper in a climate-controlled environment. A researcher who visits the reading room and requests them will receive them within 20 minutes in the standard archival clamshell boxes with white cotton gloves to wear while handling them. The handwriting is clear and consistent throughout, the Ukrainian orthography of Elena's childhood education mixed with the English of her adult life in an American coal town. The dates are precise, the observations are specific. The record she kept is, in its own way, remarkable, not because what she documented was unusual, but because she was a 63-year-old woman with no institutional power and no formal training in the relevant fields, who kept an impeccably organized record of 11 years of trying to get someone with institutional power and formal training to acknowledge what the ground beneath her feet was telling her. In the final entry, dated June 12, 1986, 2 weeks before she left, she wrote in Ukrainian, "I am packing tomorrow. The house is almost empty. I stood in the kitchen this evening and thought about all the years in that kitchen. My mother's dishes wrapped in newspaper in a box, Frank's photograph, the children's photographs, the notebooks in the bag I will carry myself, not pack with the furniture. I don't know if the notebooks matter. I don't know if anyone will read them or if anyone will do anything because of what is in them. The fire will still be burning. The men who made the decisions are in their offices or their retirements. The money is made and spent. The coal is burned. But I wrote it down. I wrote what I saw and what I was told and what the letters said. I wrote it down because the alternative was to allow it to disappear, and I would not allow that. The town disappears, the people scatter, but the account can stay. The account can wait. Someone will come looking, eventually. Someone always does. And the notebooks will be here." The ground beneath Verenka is still warm. On cold January mornings when the snow has fallen overnight and lies clean and white across the empty lower borough, you can find the places where it melts. The irregular patches of bare brown earth amid the white, each one marking a spot above the fire's path below. The patterns shift from year to year as the fire moves through new sections of the seam, but there are always patches, always those spots where the earth cannot hold the cold because something below refuses to cool. If you walk to the cemetery on such a morning, and people do walk there, they come from the neighboring towns where the former residents of Verenka settled. They come for the anniversaries and the holidays, and sometimes for no particular reason except the human pull toward the places where your people are buried. If you walk to the cemetery and press your hand to the earth between the headstones, you will feel it. The warmth rising from below, patient, steady, old as the coal, and indifferent to everything that has happened above it. It will be there tomorrow. It will be there in 100 years. It will be there in 150 years, burning through the last of the accessible seams, and then the fire will have consumed what sustained it, and it will go out at last, in the dark, in the silence, without witness. What will remain is the account, the notebooks in the archive, the photographs of the sinkhole on Haber Street, the letters that Rose Brennan, Elena's fictional counterpart in the Harrisburg hearing, spread on the table before the legislative committee. The hand-drawn map that Bogdan Rybak made at Elena's kitchen table showing how the seams ran from the dump site under the lower borough streets. And the question that none of the men in offices ever answered, that waits in the historical record the way the fire waits in the coal seams. Patient, specific, not going anywhere. Who knew, and what knowing obligated them to do? And whether the people who lived above the fire were, in somebody's calculation, an acceptable loss. The ground is still warm. The question is still open. The account is still waiting.